So for my senior project, I worked on native orchid awareness and illustration. I chose this project because around this time last year, I started developing an interest towards orchids. This interest started when my sister and I visited a botanical garden in Madison that was featuring them. After this trip, orchids really became something of interest to me, so I decided to read the book, The Orchid Thief, by Susan Orland. Soon after I finished the book, I became more aware of native orchids and started reading guides about them, particularly in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Going into summer with this new interest, I began thinking of my senior project. I knew I wanted it to involve art, but I wasn't really sure how and what the main focus would be. It wasn't until I saw my first native orchid that I decided I was going to do an orchid-based project. Once I had come to a decision, I began creating an outline for my project and decided to pursue it so I could share my interests and educate myself with others. So, as I had mentioned before, my project is focused on illustration and awareness for our native orchids. I started my project by doing field observations throughout the summer to familiarize myself with orchids as well as take pictures of them. Then throughout the fall into early spring, I illustrated 3 of the orchids I have photographed during the summer. These orchids are now being used to contribute to my service project. Once I had finished and planned out all the details of my project, I started getting really excited. Throughout my whole life, I've always had a love for plants. Growing up, I was raised in a household that consistently gardened, landscaped, and interacted with nature. Throughout my childhood and young adulthood, I have kept this respect and love for plants, so pursuing this project felt really natural to me. When first meeting these orchids, I couldn't believe that they were real, and upon more research, I couldn't believe that they were endangered and generally unknown. This is what led me to my project. I wanted to raise awareness in the best way I could, which for me was illustration. So as I started planning my project, I knew I needed to find a mentor. So I reached out to a few people, and almost every one of them recommended a colleague of theirs named Gary Eldred. I reached out to him in early June, and we connected very quickly. This was pretty easy because Gary and I shared a lot of common interests, like native plants and illustration. Throughout the summer, Gary and I took 3 trips together and ended up seeing 6 different types of orchids. During these car rides, Gary and I got to know each other pretty well. I learned that Gary is a very talented illustrator, flint knapper, and the founder of the Prairie Enthusiasts. Throughout my project, Gary took me to many field sites where he taught me about native orchids and other native plants. I cannot begin to say how honored and grateful I am to have had Gary as a mentor. He was always willing to help me in any way he could. I'm really beyond grateful that our paths have crossed and that he agreed to mentor me. So this picture is a picture of Gary and I seeing our first orchid together. That's in between us. So these are 3 of the orchids that I saw over the summer. The first one on the left is a pink lady slipper. That's the first native orchid I actually saw. Then the one in the middle is a yellow lady slipper, which I saw on my first trip with Gary. And then the last one is a purple fringe orchid, and that is the last one I saw with Gary. So after seeing my first lady slipper with Gary, which was the yellow one from the previous slide, Gary reached out to his colleague Scott and his wife Muffy and explained my project and interest in lady slippers. After this, Scott and Muffy invited us out to their farm to see a small population of showy lady orchid slippers. During this trip, I learned that Scott actually grew native orchids for a variety of conservation groups and restoration projects. This was very interesting to me because I didn't know that it was possible. So along with the showy lady orchid slipper, we also saw 3 other species of orchids. All the way to the left is a downy rattlesnake plantain, which wasn't in bloom at the time, but still has really pretty leaves with white veins. In the middle, there's a lily leaf twayblade, And all the way to the right is a green leaf twayblade, which Scott said that he randomly found growing in his greenhouse one day. So in my first slide of orchids, all of them had pretty large and colorful blooms, but a majority of our native orchids actually have like a pretty small and similar to these ones with their bud size and plant size. So after summer had ended, I had seen 7 of our native orchids and had intended to illustrate each one. I decided to go with the process of stippling, which is pretty commonly used for plant illustration. So essentially for this style, you're using a bunch of small dots to create a larger image. This ended up being very time consuming for me because my pen size was 003, which if you don't know is the size of the tip of a needle. After I had began an illustration, I was 15 hours in and basically nowhere. This was really disappointing to me because I realized I would have to reevaluate my plan. So I decided to reduce the number of illustrations. This way I could spend a significant time on each one and not feel rushed. However, now I would need to select 3 out of the 7. This was a difficult decision for me because I wanted to be able to show off the unique beauty and raise awareness for each orchid I was able to meet. So after much consideration, I decided to illustrate the 3 lady slipper orchids. I chose these 3 because they complemented each other well and shared a lot of unique characteristics. So this is the first one that I illustrated, which is the pink lady slipper orchid. It is also the first orchid that I saw, which initially got me started on this project. This is the second orchid that I drew, which is the orchid that I saw with Gary when I first met him. And this one was the last one of my illustrations, which was the showy lady slipper. And it was the one that brought us to Scott's farm. So once I had completed my illustrations, I was ready to start the fundraising aspect of my project. So I found a local photographer, Jack Hill, who photographed and printed my illustrations onto cards and 11 by 14 prints. These prints are currently being sold at Bonton and are available by contacting me. My contact information will be at the end. 100% of these proceeds go to the Ridge Sanctuary's Orchid Restoration Project. This is a project dedicated to native orchid conservation and restoration in Wisconsin. And I would really appreciate anyone who is interested in buying the prints and donating to them. So as I'm finishing up the goals of my project, I wanted to share how my views of orchids have changed. Throughout the course of this project, I've learned a lot about orchids and turned an interest into a relationship. I have always viewed orchids as fragile foreign objects. In my mind, orchids have been selectively overbred to catch consumers' eyes. Customers buy orchids from shopping centers, take them home, admire their beauty, and kill them several days later. This observation is what led me to feel like orchids were beautiful, fragile, and unfortunately replaceable once they had died. However, these feelings changed when I visited the botanical gardens in Madison. Here for the first time, they felt like real plants. My views changed again when I saw them growing on their own. They were distinctive and unexpected. I couldn't believe I never knew they existed. And although my project was mainly focused on illustration and my field observations, another reason I created this project is because native orchids are actually in decline. Due to mass agriculture, invasive species, habitat loss, and poaching, orchids are in a vulnerable state. And unfortunately, not too much is being done to resolve these issues, and native orchids seem to be in a continual decline. Through all of this development, I developed a deep admiration for them and their determination. I began to admire orchids not only for their round leaves, unique blossoms, colors, shapes, and sizes, but also for how hard they work to stay here. As my view of orchids changed, I learned more about my love and appreciation for plants. This love not only appeared in my admiration and respect when I saw orchids and illustrated them, but also as I learned more about the struggles they faced. So, from this project, I gained a true understanding of passion. Every person who assisted me with this project was overjoyed and eager to share their love for native plants with me. This passion was shared with me in every car ride, walk, email, and phone call, in the smiles and conversations surrounding orchids and other native plants. Each decision made surrounding the project was fueled by the time and wisdom given to me by advisors. They saw my interest and nurtured it. Although I have decided to pursue a career in illustration, I still hope to work with native plants and orchids. I will forever carry with me the passion I have learned and the experiences I had, and I hope to share them in the same way it has been shared with me. So for my thank yous, I would like to thank the Ho-Chunk Land for growing all these orchids and allowing me to travel around. I would like to thank my sister Willow for sharing my interests and helping me in every way she could, whenever she could. I would like to thank my mentor Gary and the Prairie Enthusiasts for mentoring me and sharing my love for native plants. I would like to thank Jack, Scott, and Muffy for all their help on my project. My mom, my dad, and my brother Sky for always supporting me. Sean for helping me with all the senior projectness, giving me encouragement. Everyone who has bought my prints and will donate to the native orchids. And of course, each of the orchids I got to see over the summer.
All right, just rolling in here. Wow. Go Mila. Wow, Mila, you are so talented. Wow, gorgeous, stunning. Mila, wonderful, wonderful job, Mila. Mila, those are some marvelous drawings. Congratulations. I learned a lot. Thank you. Mila, this is amazing. I learned so much about native orchids. How much are you selling the prints for?
So the prints here, let me get.
Don't mess around. Show the prints.
So the prints are this big, and they're going for $25 each, and 100% of the proceeds are going to the foundation, and it's $5 for cards that are about this big.
Go off, girl, said Maela. Wonderful presentation from your aunts in Chicago. All right, a question from Millie. What makes a plant an orchid? That's a really.
That's a question.
Whoa.
Just how, I guess, defined by species. I don't know. I'm getting section into it. The, like characteristics.
Why did you choose black and white as your modality?
Just because I enjoy doing stippling, and I think I enjoy like doing a little section at a time, and then it creates like this bigger piece, and with like colored pencils and stuff, you can't really do that.
Question front here.
How do you get so talented?
My mom. My dad.
All right, genes. It seems like genes is that's she's coming down on. Stipple Queen, says Don Knight. Okay, congratulations. Great.
Yes, Gary.
Gary.
How long before we get to chase orchids again this summer?
As soon as possible.
Yay!